This series discusses crime scenes, details regarding unidentified decedents, discussion of drug use, and references historic media that may use outdated language regarding a variety of social issues, including topics like immigration, housing insecurity, and sex work. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. This episode, we're back in Nashville, covering the city's unidentified persons from the last 4 decades, the cold cases that need your help in their resolution. And this time around, we're focused on what may be some of the most difficult Doe identifications for Metro Nashville PD, victims who were likely unhoused at the time of their deaths. The truth is that we can't know, not for certain, the life circumstances of any of the victims featured this season. Anyone can face housing insecurity, and context clues don't paint the full picture. Some of the victims who may have been unhoused are featured in another upcoming episode, focused on John and Jane Does who were found soon after death and who were readily identifiable, but who still have not been reconnected with their identities. And some people featured in this episode may have had stable housing. In some cases, the circumstances of where they were recovered led law enforcement to consider the possibility that they did not. In others, context more clearly indicates that the people featured were living without stable housing when they died. This matters for a few reasons. First, it affects who investigators reach out to when they're searching for a missing person who may match a description from a previously reported case. In addition to circulating a Doe victim's information to the media, they'll speak to outreach services and to people who may be living in the area where a victim was discovered, particularly if there's a semi-permanent or a permanent encampment nearby. But they also know that, in the case of a victim who's unhoused, there may be less likelihood of finding a recently filed missing persons report. That's not to say that no report exists. Friends or family may well have filed reports, but they might have been submitted years before the death of their loved one, and perhaps cities or states or even countries away. And if communication was not consistent, a victim's friends or family may not have even known where their loved one was or that they were in Tennessee. We've also been told of situations in which staff at shelters and other outreach programs have actually filed missing persons reports when community members suddenly stop showing up for services, but there's no guarantee that that will happen. In our episode covering the disappearance of Patrick Allen Guild, who was living in a permanent encampment in Nashville, one where he'd built a tiny cabin, when he went missing, we touched on some of the issues that will come up in today's episode. One of the most pressing tasks a cold case investigator has when they inherit a case, if they are actually going to try and solve that case, is to review everything and to go back and follow up on leads. That means speaking to witnesses, finding addresses, looking up phone numbers, and reviewing clues. In an unidentified person's case, so many of those factors are already missing, and in the case of a victim who may have been unhoused, it's even more complicated. Those outreach groups, they may no longer exist. People may have used nicknames or aliases in community. Witnesses who were questioned could also have been unhoused, and thus harder to track down 10 or 20 years later. When Brooke spoke with Detective Matthew Filter of Metro Nashville PD about the cases for this episode, she asked him to explain the layers of difficulty that he might encounter when the victim is likely to be unhoused.
Probably the biggest obstacle to overcome with the unhoused community is the general lack of information available. The unhoused community is often a very tight community, especially within specific camps. They are leery around law enforcement and sometimes don't want to cooperate out of fear of getting themselves or someone else in trouble. However, usually when we have the opportunity to explain the case we're working and the kind of information we are looking for, most will open up to us and at least provide some information that can be useful. The people that work with the unhoused community in Nashville are also very helpful when it comes to helping us with missing or unidentified persons. Another obstacle is they are essentially living off the grid, and there isn't the paper trail that the average person has that can be researched to help identify someone. Many don't have state IDs, and a lot of them work jobs where they are paid cash, so there's no bank accounts or employment records. When you have someone that has a fixed address, they're typically going to have bills to pay, whether it be rent or mortgage or some type of utility bill. There's going to be a paper trail that will lead us to the identity of this person. And a person that has a fixed address is likely going to have a steady job with an employer and employees that will know them and their routine, as well as have some personal information about them. Also, with a fixed address, most people get to know their neighbors if they stay in one place for a significant amount of time. So often, neighbors can provide a wealth of information about a person, even if they don't necessarily know them well. With the unhoused, you don't usually have any of that. At best, you'll have some people within the camps or at some of the unhoused resources available that may have some information about them. When you talk to unhoused individuals, you find that many of them are not native Nashvillians. A lot of them are from other states. And when you have someone that has no local connection of any kind to the area, that can make it extremely difficult to identify someone or locate family.
In our episode on Pat Gilt's disappearance, we discussed the Nashville floods that destroyed a major permanent encampment along the Cumberland River and displaced many people who'd lived there for a very long time. Other issues like need to be close to shifting locations of jobs or public resources and city ordinances aimed at discouraging encampments. All these and more can affect where people move and make it even more difficult to find them for follow-up interviews. And buildings that served as shelters a few decades ago, they may be long gone. When we covered Pat's case, we also discussed housing insecurity in Nashville. As we explained then, Nashville is a very expensive city and has grown more so in the past few decades. It's become much harder to secure affordable housing. As a 2021 Nashville Scene article explained, housing vouchers don't solve the issue because real estate scarcity remains a problem and landlords are not always willing to accept them. When we spoke with Detective Filter, we asked him if he had any estimates on how many people are unhoused in Nashville. In this case, living primarily outdoors in encampments and vehicles, or seeking regular services and shelters. We do want to note that there are other people, including many families with young children, who are experiencing housing insecurity and who live in short-term rentals, such as motels. Often they are not counted when estimates are made because they're not considered to be technically homeless.
I would say since the 1980s, the unhoused population in Nashville has more than doubled. The last count I can remember was done in 2022, and there was about 1,900 people counted. I would personally estimate the total unhoused population in Nashville would be over 2,000 at any given time, just because I'm sure some people didn't get counted for one reason or another, and some are transient. They'll come to Nashville and stay a few weeks to a few months and then go somewhere else for a while.
This episode covers 9 such cases, and they aren't concentrated in any single neighborhood of the Metro Nashville area. When we spoke with Detective Filter, Brooke asked him to describe the recovery locations covered in this episode.
In terms of these cases, can you describe how close, in terms of general proximity, they are to each other?
They were all in Davidson County, it's about as close a proximity as I can give you. There's definitely no pattern or consistency to where they are found. A couple were found within the downtown loop, a few were found along the side of the interstate, a couple were found in abandoned buildings, and a few more were found in wooded areas. The areas are just vary quite a bit. The downtown loop is very urban. So most of Nashville's unhoused are found in this area because that is where the majority of resources such as food pantries, shelters, wash facilities, etc., are located. Many of the unhoused want more secluded spots to set up camp that would afford them more privacy and, in some cases, safety. A lot of unhoused people also have jobs and will establish a camp near where they work. It really seems to depend on who the individual is and, I guess, what kind of life they're living or trying to live. Being unhoused really determines where they're going to end up or how they're going to live, whether they're going to live in a large community with other unhoused people or they're going to kind of go and live off on their own.
So they were fairly disparate. They wouldn't have been any major encampments.
Now, in fact, none of these remains were found in an encampment anywhere, or not in a major encampment at least.
That is significant because immediately it affects the number of potential witnesses who could be questioned at the time that the victim's remains were recovered. That is certainly a consideration in the first case of our episode and the most recent case that we're discussing today. It involves the discovery of a man's remains at Antioch Pike Road in the Antioch neighborhood. According to the Tennessean, it's a fast-growing area about 12 miles southeast of downtown. In a wooded area along Antioch Pike, a citizen came upon skeletal remains at an apparent encampment and called Metro Nashville PD. When they arrived, they discovered the skeletal remains and clothing of a presumed male who showed no obvious signs of trauma. There were no other context clues that could help them at the scene, no personal items. All they could note was that he had worn blue jeans, a black shirt, and a black belt with a gray metal buckle. When the anthropological exam was completed, the most important information, in terms of possible identification, came. The Antioch Pike John Doe had likely been between the ages of 30 and 42 years old, and between 5'1" and 5'8". He was estimated to be, quote, a Native American male. He also had several distinctive healed injuries that would make him highly identifiable should a possible match be found and medical records compared. 3 healed cranium fractures, a healed rib fracture, and a healed pelvic injury. Again, these are fairly significant injuries, and it's likely that those who knew him in life would be aware of them. And further, any medical records that exist would reflect care for that level of injury. Whether he sustained them at the same time or separately, we can't know. We have talked about MMIP, or Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples, cases on the Fall Line many times before. At the writing of this episode, there are 574 cases listed in NamUs for what the database terms, quote, American Indian and Alaska Native men. Does that number capture the actual figures? Probably not. And none of those 574 cases are local to Tennessee, but people travel. And as Detective Filter has said, many people have moved to Nashville in the last few decades. So it's important to consider anyone from across the country as a possible match for the Antioch John Doe. Metro Nashville is pursuing a DNA profile for forensic investigative genetic genealogy in his case, but that may take some time, so your help is needed. It's estimated that the Antioch John Doe would have been deceased for at least a year prior to the discovery of his remains, so at least 2021, if not longer. And he may have been missing or separated from his family for much longer than that. Another case in which location and lack of possible witnesses plays a role is the discovery of a John Doe victim found off I-65 North. It wasn't so much the location but the circumstances that led the original investigators to consider that the victim may have been unhoused, though, as Detective Filter will explain, that is not a foregone conclusion. According to the Tennessean, the skeletal remains of a presumed male were discovered, quote, near Interstate 65's northbound lanes by an employee of Lamar Sign Company on August 23, 2004. The police report notes that this was near where Wedgwood Avenue meets I-65, That's a historic neighborhood in Nashville that's recently seen major redevelopment. As for Lamar Sign Company, you've probably seen their logo along highways before, on the bottoms of billboards. Per the Tennessean, the Lamar employee was in the process of cutting back brush from a billboard when they came upon skeletal remains of a person. The Tennessean described the victim as, quote, dressed in blue jeans, gray socks, and a long-sleeved green shirt, layered over a thermal long john style shirt. According to the then Metro Nashville spokesman, the victim was also found with an empty wallet. The Metro Nashville spokesman told reporters at the time, quote, this could be suggestive of a homeless individual, although that's not conclusive. At the time, the spokesman noted that there were no obvious signs of trauma that would take further examination to determine for sure. Authorities said that they were checking missing persons reports for anyone that could possibly match the biological profile of the victim, which was still being assessed by experts. As a reminder, the biological profile includes age, stature, ancestry or race, and sex, though, of course, not all those factors can be assessed in every case. And, as we've discussed many times before, those estimates may be updated when case materials are reviewed. But, in the case of the I-65 John Doe, an anthropologist was able to offer a fairly extensive report. According to the estimates in the file, the victim was a presumed male of European ancestry, somewhere between 35 and 60 years old, and between 5'9" and about 6'3". PMI, or postmortem interval, was difficult to determine, but the anthropologist reviewing the case estimated that it was likely that the I-65 John Doe had been deceased for a year or more. He'd also experienced a number of broken bones in his lifetime that had long healed by the time of his death. These included broken ribs and the bones of his left arm. There was also evidence that during life, he'd fractured his left fibula. That's the bone that runs on the outside of the lower leg. These are significant enough injuries that, again, someone who knew him would have known about them. When further examination was done, it was apparent that the I-65 John Doe had sustained trauma at the time of death that indicated he was the victim of homicide, which changes the perspective on why his body was found where it was. We should also add that there was no sign that he'd been living in the area where his remains were recovered. It was the fully empty wallet that had cued the original investigators that he may have been unhoused. That and perhaps the location of recovery. In a robbery, a partially empty wallet, say money and credit cards and even ID taken, or the lack of a wallet altogether, that might be more expected than an empty wallet. That may have been what the original investigator based his initial suggestion on. They didn't limit any case comparisons based on that fact, they just considered it as a possible lead. Remember also that there were no clear signs of trauma at the time that the I-65 John Doe was recovered, so the theory that he could have died of natural causes was on the table, another factor that could have indicated to investigators that he was unhoused. But that was an early comment on the case, and the only article that we could find that covered the I-65 John Doe at all. There was no further reporting, which would have allowed investigators to expand based on further information that they may have discovered. When we spoke with Detective Filter, we asked him to tell us a little more about the case.
I also believe this case may be a homicide based on the injuries. Based on the location, it is completely possible he could have been dumped at the location, as I doubt very many people walk through that particular area.
And we know that his wallet was empty.
His wallet being completely empty is a little unusual. I would expect any man, including an unhoused man, to have some things in his wallet if he is carrying it around, even if it is nothing more than scraps of paper with phone numbers. If the person was unhoused, I would not be surprised at the lack of cash. However, if this person was not unhoused, then the lack of cash and identification would cause me to lean more to homicide.
But based on the anthropologist's comments on the state of injury to the bones and the description of blunt and sharp force trauma, do you have any further detail you can offer about possible cause of death?
I would consider this a homicide. This person had a lot of perimortem trauma, especially to the skull. Considering 6 separate impact sites identified on the skull, I don't know what else this could be. If there were only 1 or 2, some type of accident couldn't be ruled out. But with that many impacts in such a close proximity, I feel accident is unlikely.
I know that the healed antemortem fractures, broken bones in the victim's report could be helpful in matching him with a possible missing person. Did anything else stand out to you in terms of maybe dentition or other skeletal features that you feel would be particularly helpful in ruling in or out a possible match?
He had some dental work, but had several crown abscess, which to me would indicate poor oral health. Otherwise, I did not see anything that would be particularly helpful until we can get a possible name for the person.
The department is currently raising funding for DNA testing and FIGG in this case, but we need your help to circulate what we know so far about the victim. A presumed white male between 35 and 60 years old and between 5'9" and 6'3", who likely would have been missing for at least a year. So likely since 2003 or even before. This man had broken ribs, a broken left arm, a serious break of 2 bones, and a fractured left fibula in his lifetime. When discovered, he was found with the following clothing, quote, blue jeans, gray socks, and a long-sleeve green shirt, layered over with a thermal long john-style shirt. Where 6th Avenue South crosses Mulberry Street in Nashville, there's the I-40 overpass. That's where, in 1988, a deceased man was discovered. He had sought shelter under the bridge for some period of time. There was a carpet there for warmth and what appeared to be his personal belongings, clothes that were in the vicinity. He also was wearing several layers of shirts and pants and a jacket. There were no clear signs as to why he had died, and no obvious trauma noted at the time that he was discovered. The weight and height measurements that we found in his file suggest that he was slight, 5 feet and around 130 pounds. Investigators found a business card with the name and phone number of a local social worker printed on it. According to the file, the deceased appeared to be a black male. No age estimation was given in the report, but we do know that he was found soon after death because medical legal professionals were able to take fingerprints for comparison. That social worker's card was a strong lead, and investigators hoped that they would be able to identify the I-40 Bridge John Doe, but the social worker didn't recognize him. When investigators spoke with local outreach workers and other locals, they had a number of names to share. People who might have known the man, but none of those names brought them any closer to a possible identity either. 2 separate locals suggested that the I-40 John Doe might actually be a man named Roland, who was known to camp at the I-40 bridge. A convenience store clerk mentioned that Roland stopped in the store regularly and that she gave him food. She thought that the description sounded like him. Another local resident actually approached investigators at the recovery scene with similar information. She thought the I-40 John Doe could be Roland too. She told them that Roland was 20 to 30 years old and that she only knew his first name. She explained that he'd come from Texas and that he'd been living in Nashville for 2 years. But when Metro Nashville PD showed her a picture of the I-40 John Doe, she said that it wasn't Roland. Investigators were never able to find Roland, as far as we can tell from the files, so there's no way to fully rule him out in this case. And because it's an old file, we don't have as much information as we'd like. But the name Roland, it may be important. And the Metro Nashville PD is submitting the I-40 John Doe's case for forensic investigative genetic genealogy. So, hopefully, the dead-end investigators met in the 1980s will eventually be overcome. There's another bridge tied to another case, a much more recent one. The Craighead Bridge sits at Browns Creek, a body of water that flows toward Cumberland River. And in October of 2016, the volunteer group Hands on Nashville had gathered at that site. According to News Channel 5, they'd planned to, quote, clean up a portion of Browns Creek near the Nashville Fairgrounds. During their work, one of the volunteers stumbled upon, quote, what appeared to be human remains. And based on police records, this would have been in the woods alongside the creek. Authorities were called to the scene and a full search was conducted. According to News Channel 5, they were able to recover further skeletal remains in their sweep of the creek and of the woods. Clothing and a number of wallet-sized cards were recovered as well, including an EBT card and a Red Roof Inn Ready card. Both those cards featured names, different names, of separate individuals. Police also discovered a pile of mail nearby, and that was addressed to many different individuals. All of those items presented immediate leads for investigators. So we asked Detective Filter about them before we got into any more specific details regarding the Browns Creek John Doe.
Yeah, so when they searched the creek, they found a lot of items with names, including a pile of U.S. mail that we're presuming was stolen. The two cards that you referenced were found in close proximity to the body. There were several names the lead detective checked into that were found in the area, and all the individuals were found to be alive.
It's unclear how the cards came to be in the vicinity of the Browns Creek John Doe. It's possible he could have carried them. How he could have come into possession of them is unknown, and if they'd been in his pockets, that was something experts could not determine. As Detective Filter told News Channel 5 at that time, quote, the clothing was pretty well rotted away. The pile of mail, though, was at a considerable distance from the recovery scene, and no clear connection could be drawn to the case. When further investigation was done, experts determined that the Browns Creek John Doe was likely a male of European descent and somewhere between 40 and 66 years of age. His stature or height range is wide, anywhere from 5'4" to 6 feet tall. The details on his clothing are limited because of the damage, but we know that he had at least one black hospital-issue sock, wore size 38 waist tan pants, and a brown belt, quote, with a yellow metallic buckle. According to the police file, he likely broke a rib during his life, one that healed sometime before death. And experts were unable to determine a cause of death. Locals who spoke with investigators noted that recently they had not seen a man who had long lived in the area, a man who was unhoused, for quite some time. But unfortunately, Metro Nashville PD was unable to gather any more information on that man as a possible lead. Without any missing persons who matched the Browns Creek John Doe's description, the Metro Nashville Police Force has turned to forensic investigative genetic genealogy. According to News Channel 5, that work began last summer. That's when Metro Nashville PD sent off samples for testing. A successful profile was developed in Browns Creek John Doe's case, and Detective Filter tells us that there have been some developments as far as genealogy goes, but they have hit some roadblocks as well.
We recently got a genealogy report back with some preliminary information. The person is believed to be a sister living in the Williamsburg, Virginia area. I have attempted to contact her through several phone numbers, email, and U.S. mail and have not received a response. I haven't received any further updates from the genealogist until I have a chance to go up to Virginia and knock on some doors. This case is stalled.
While the Browns Creek John Doe may himself have ties to Virginia, that's not a given. It may simply be that his relatives have relocated there. Still, it's worth considering when looking at missing persons. Think of a white male who may have been somewhere between the ages of 40 and 66 years old in the 2010s, and who may have lived in Virginia at some point in his life. He may have lost close contact with his family in the years preceding, and he may have stayed at a hospital or treatment center in the time preceding his death. Browns Creek John Doe is not the only unidentified decedent who may have been in a hospital preceding his death. At Charlotte Pike and 25th Avenue in October of 2016, a maintenance crew came upon the remains of a victim now known as the Charlotte Pike John Doe. He was found within a week of the Browns Creek John Doe and less than 10 miles away. There's no connection between the cases, not that law enforcement can see, but still, that's two unidentified decedents found within a week of each other, and both cases still remain open. The Charlotte Pike John Doe was found near an encampment, a small one that the Tennessean described as, quote, one tent behind a copse of trees near some railroad tracks. The Charlotte Pike John Doe may have resided there, but authorities couldn't be sure. Inside the tent, which police records estimate was about 30 yards away from where the victim was found, there were medical release papers from a St. Thomas Midtown hospital. What did seem clear at the scene, though, was that the Charlotte Pike John Doe had experienced significant trauma. And let us be clear, we don't mean trauma that resulted in death, because that could not be determined. But perhaps this individual had experienced some kind of significant injury, critical injury, in a car accident or something similar, shortly before he died. After examination, it was determined that the Charlotte Pike John Doe was likely of European ancestry and between the ages of 35 to 60. He's estimated to have been between 5'7" and 5'11". He had gray hair and a red-gray beard. He was found with the following clothing. According to NamUs, a red t-shirt with the Pringles logo printed on the front, tan pants, a black belt, white Nike sneakers, and white socks. What was most notable to us, though, were the antemortem injuries noted by the anthropologist. The victim had experienced a number of fairly recent bone fractures. He was also found to be wearing a medical bracelet, similar to those issued by hospitals, and there was a metal walking cane found in the grass, just a few feet from where he lay. More signs that pointed to some kind of serious incident that would have caused multiple injuries. And the fractures noted in the anthropology report indicated that the breaks would have been fairly recent. With evidence at the scene, the medical papers, the bracelet, even the cane, it seems like it might have been easy to trace the Charlotte Pike John Doe, particularly if he'd been a patient at a local hospital or a clinic. But Detective Filter told us that those leads proved elusive. Was there any way of tracking or identifying any information regarding the cane that was found with the body?
No, the cane came from a medical supply place which had multiple locations in Tennessee. There was no unique identifier on the cane.
Did any leads come in from local shelters or related services?
No, I have not received any information provided by unhoused services.
Do you think there's indication that the decedent may have been at a hospital or treatment center of some kind relatively recent to his time of death?
There was a yellow plastic bracelet typically put on people's wrists when they are admitted into a medical facility. Unfortunately, any identifying markings on the bracelet had worn off. The decedent had several broken and healed bones as though he had been in an accident of some kind at some point in his life.
The medical papers in the tent did seem like a strong lead, but did not point to identification. DNA was uploaded to CODIS, and a number of possible missing people were excluded based on that profile. Others, who didn't have samples available, had to be compared based on dental records or detective work. That meant tracking down relatives and trying to find out where the missing people had last been seen, tracing addresses, and trying to find or rule out links to Nashville. Eventually, Metro Nashville decided to go the route of FIGG, and they secured funding. And now, the testing in genealogy has progressed. The Charlotte Pike John Doe may have family ties to Kentucky, but it's possible he lived away from the state for a long period of time, and it's likely that he was, indeed, in a car accident sometime before his death. This may not be the hospital stay that correlates with the bracelet he was wearing when he was recovered, though. So, if you know of a missing person who was in an accident some years before 2016, don't rule them out based on that timeline. Because there were no clear signs of trauma, he very well could have died of natural causes. The bracelet could have been tied to that. or he may well have been wearing it for an extended period of time. In January of 2018, a citizen who'd set up a camp off I-40 East contacted police. They'd been walking along a rocky area, boarding the exit 52 ramp, when they came upon a sleeping bag at a small campsite and discovered the skeletal remains of a human. When Metro Nashville PD responded, they discovered the remains, as well as what seemed to be a collapsed tent constructed of tarps, blankets, and a sleeping bag. They also found a social security card and a fanny pack that contained a slip of paper. On it was, quote, handwritten personal identifying information. It was clear based on vegetation growth that the decedent, exit 52 John Doe, had been there for a long time, probably years. And, as you've probably guessed, the social security card and information from the fanny pack did not lead investigators back to an identity for exit 52 John Doe. But the medical legal professionals were able to give a little more information that could be useful in comparing him to possible missing persons. As in the other cases we've discussed today, any comparisons we mention should be given a wide date range, perhaps far before the recovery of 2018. When the experts completed their assessment, they stated that the exit 52 John Doe was a male of European descent, likely between 40 and 65 years old, and he was tall, probably 6 foot to 6'4". He'd had a broken nose in life that had long since healed, and a broken rib. There were no signs of trauma, and cause and manner of death were unknown. You're going to hear us say that a lot in these episodes. No sign of trauma, cause and manner unknown. Sometimes it's because the person's remains are skeletal, and without clear evidence that affected bone, there's simply no way to know. In other cases, it's likely that a John or Jane Doe died of natural or accidental causes. When someone does not have stable housing, they're much more likely to die outside, of illness, the effects of weather, or of a medical event. We can't say what happened. And as Detective Filter explained last episode, when he told us about Vandy Jane Doe, each case is still approached as a possible homicide because of the importance of preserving evidence and forensic examination. But the truth is, many Does are not homicide victims. We, the media, are just likely to focus most on those who are. Exit 52 John Doe's DNA has been uploaded to CODIS, and he's currently up for further DNA testing so that FIGG can proceed. The final cases we're sharing with you today are linked by similarity of location. The first is that of the Vashti Street John Doe. In February of 2017, a Crime Stoppers tip came in from North Nashville in the Cumberland Heights area of the city. The caller reported that there was a deceased person in a vacant building on Vashti Street. Permission to search the property was secured from the owner, and when Metro Nashville was dispatched, officers discovered the skeletal remains of the Vashti Street John Doe. It seemed clear that the Vashti Street John Doe had been living in the building, but for how long, they couldn't say. It appeared as though he may have died in his sleep, but the case needed to be treated as a potential homicide. Based on the examination of medical legal professionals, it appeared that the Vashti Street John Doe had not suffered any trauma prior to death, but cause and manner were officially undetermined. He was a presumed male, about 40 to 65 years of age, and stood somewhere between 5'3" and 6 feet tall. Based on anthropological examination, the Vashti Street John Doe was described as of probable European and Asian ancestry, and he had dealt with extensive tooth loss during life. According to NamUs, he was dressed in 2 jackets, a tan or brown canvas one and a blue one with an Astro Boats logo on the back, and in black Lee brand jeans. Unfortunately, no one in the immediate area had any information. No one knew of an individual who'd been living in the building, and local outreach had no information about missing persons in the unhoused community that might match the description of the Vashti Street John Doe. His DNA was uploaded to CODIS in 2019, And in 2022, Metro Nashville made the decision to move forward with further testing for forensic investigative genetic genealogy. The final case of this episode is that of the Lafayette John Doe, who was discovered in January of 2022. Like the Vashti Street John Doe, he was found on the property of a business, in this case, in the parking lot of a used car lot on Lafayette Street. That's not far from the Nashville Rescue Mission, just about a mile, and on the same road. The Lafayette Street John Doe was discovered soon after death, and the medical examiner was able to determine how he died, of natural causes, but that didn't give them any clues as to his identity or how they could reach his family or other loved ones to inform them of his passing. The TBI, that's the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, quickly got forensic art out there so it could be circulated with a news story detailing the facts of his case. According to WSMV, the Lafayette John Doe was a presumed black male, quote, believed to be 40 to 60 years old. The man had short black and gray hair, a trimmed black and gray beard, and a mustache. Per Fox 17, he weighed approximately 209 pounds and was about 6'1". The Lafayette John Doe did not carry any identification or clues that might lead investigators to his identity, and his clothing was nondescript. A gray t-shirt and socks and cargo pants. He was underdressed for the cold January weather, and he did not have shoes. The Nashville Rescue Mission, being so close by, was a possible lead for investigators, who were hopeful that staff would recognize the Lafayette John Doe, but no one was able to give them a positive identification. And there were no other locals who could provide a name either. But with the new tool of FIGG, Metro Nashville has an option besides labeling his case as all leads exhausted, and the Lafayette John Doe's case is currently with Othram Labs. And according to Detective Filter, the case has progressed. So listen closely. We do have information to share. They've developed the following leads so far. The surnames Wisner, Lewis, Billinger or Billinger, and King appear in his family tree, and all families appear to live in the northeast area of Texas. If any of those family names in that region are familiar to you, please share this episode and the flyers we've prepared with your social circle and on social media. If you have specific information regarding a missing family member or loved one that matches this description, please reach out to Metro Nashville PD. We will share that information in our show notes and at the end of the episode. Over the last several years, we've talked a lot about how important forensic investigative genetic genealogy can be in cold cases, but perhaps that impact is most felt in cases like the ones we've presented today, where leads are exhausted so quickly. People are less likely to share the story of a man found under a bridge who may have died from natural causes, and that makes it even harder to find out who he was in life. The tools available, as imperfect as they may be, can help to level that uneven field, if the funding is available. We know that we gave you a lot of cases to think about today, some with more detail than others, but that's the hard thing about John and Jane Doe cases. Sometimes there's just so little. And when it's the case of someone cut off from the resources that allow us to establish ourselves and create all the connections of safety and stability, there are even fewer ties. So, no matter how little we know, we still need to try. Forensic art or not, detailed story or not much at all. For every fact that we can gather, maybe it will be the one that will catch the eye of someone who is out there looking with a missing person in mind. We have prepared flyers for each of the cases presented today. They are all available on our social media and our website, and we encourage you to share them, particularly if you live in Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky, or Texas. If you have any information regarding any of the cases we discussed, please contact Detective Filter at Metro Nashville Police at 615-862-7803. You can also call Nashville Crime Stoppers at 615-74-CRIME or 7463. Callers may remain anonymous and may qualify for a cash reward. Next time on The Fall Line, we continue our coverage of Nashville cold unidentified persons cases. We're covering the stories of 3 unidentified homicide victims whose killers are known, who actually confessed. But those victims themselves still need reconnection to their identities and to their loved ones. If you know of a case that should be covered on The Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independently produced show, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIAs, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. And if you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And take a moment to rate and review our show on your podcast app of choice. My book, Lay Them to Rest, which covers years of my life working on a Jane Doe case in the world of forensic scientists who resolve unidentified persons cases, is out everywhere now as hardcover, ebook, and audiobook, read by me. You can order it anywhere you get books and through your local library. Find out more through the link in our show notes. And if you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. 100% of our Patreon and Apple Premium earnings are supporting our Family Therapy Fund and actively paying for therapy for families who've appeared on the show. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. Or if you prefer Apple Premium, you can subscribe there as well. On Patreon, we also post occasional giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton, with additional research assistance from Brian Waters and Anna Luria. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Brandy C. Williams. And, as always, our most special thanks to Liz Lipka.